By November 1918, intelligence estimated that tens of thousands of Schwarzlose machine guns remained scattered across the wreckage of a collapsing empire, from the Isonzo trenches to the barracks of Vienna, Budapest, Prague, and Zagreb. Unlike the German High Seas Fleet or the Fokker squadrons, there was no single power to negotiate their surrender, because by the time the guns fell silent, the empire that had built them no longer existed. Austria-Hungary had fractured into half a dozen successor states within weeks of the armistice, and each one now eyed the depots, arsenals, and regimental stores where these distinctive water-cooled weapons sat, unclaimed and enormously valuable to whoever could seize them first. The Schwarzlose M0712 was, by 1918, one of the most widely produced machine guns of the war, manufactured at the Österreichische Waffenfabriksgesellschaft works in Steyr, and under license elsewhere, chambered for the 8-Polite 50mm Terresmar Mannlicher cartridge, and prized for its mechanical simplicity. It used a toggle-delayed blowback system rather than the recoil-operated locking of the Maxim, which meant fewer moving parts, easier maintenance in the field, and a weapon that could be manufactured relatively quickly under wartime pressure. It had armed infantry, been mounted in fortresses along the Italian front, fitted to aircraft, and even adapted for naval use. When the fighting stopped, nobody in Paris, London, or Washington much cared what became of it, because attention was fixed on the German army's far larger arsenal. That relative neglect is precisely what makes the Schwarzlose's post-war fate so revealing. It did not vanish under Allied supervision, so much as it was quietly divided, converted, and absorbed by the very nations that had once fought under the same imperial eagle. And its story says a great deal about how an empire's weapons outlived the empire itself. The situation the victorious powers found in late 1918 was one of administrative chaos rather than the tidy internments of Scapa Flow or the aircraft depots of northern France. Austria-Hungary's army had numbered several million men at its peak, and estimates of wartime Schwarzlose production run to around 40,000 guns across all variants and manufacturers. When the empire dissolved, its regiments, depots, and factories fell under the control of whichever successor government now occupied that territory. Czechoslovakia inherited substantial stocks, along with the Škoda and Steyr production know-how. The kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, soon Yugoslavia, absorbed guns from Croatian and Slovenian garrisons. Poland acquired examples from the Galician depots. Hungary, reduced to a fraction of its former territory under the terms eventually imposed at Trianon, retained a domestic stock and continued producing spare parts. Austria itself, now a small republic of some 6 million people, kept comparatively few, hemmed in by the disarmament clauses of the Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, signed in September 1919, which capped the new Austrian army at 30,000 men and placed strict limits on the machine guns it was permitted to retain. The Inter-Allied Military Control Commission, modeled on the body overseeing German disarmament, was tasked with verifying Austrian compliance, inspecting arsenals and certifying destruction of surplus stock, though its resources and attention were consistently dwarfed by the parallel commission operating in Germany. What emerged was less a single race to capture enemy technology and more a scramble among former subjects of the same crown to claim a share of its abandoned arsenal, a distinctly Central European variation on the disposal stories that played out elsewhere across the former combatant nations. Italy's approach was the most direct expression of Victor's justice. Rome had fought Austria-Hungary directly along the Isonzo and at Caporetto and Vittorio Veneto, and reparations negotiations secured Italy nearly 900 Schwarzlose guns taken directly from Austrian stocks as war reparations. Italian ordnance officers inspected consignments at Trieste and Fiume, cataloging weapons before shipment to arsenals on the mainland. Chiefly, the Regio Esercito's depots around Turin and Terni, where technical staff assessed the guns against Italy's own standard-issue weaponry, principally the Fiat Ravelli. Rather than scrapping the hull outright, Italian technicians converted a substantial portion to fire the 6.5mm Carcano cartridge, already standard across the Italian army, simplifying logistics and extending the weapon's service life by more than a decade. Many of these converted Schwarzlose guns were subsequently allocated not to frontline infantry units, but to territorial anti-aircraft duties, and a number were shipped onward to Italy's colonial garrisons in Libya and East Africa, where obsolescence by European standards still represented perfectly adequate firepower against colonial insurgencies. Italian testing reports from the early 1920s, held today in military archives in Rome, noted the weapon's reliability in desert conditions, a point of genuine surprise given the gun's water cooling system, which engineers had assumed would prove impractical outside temperate climates. France's involvement was comparatively marginal, since French forces had not fought Austria-Hungary directly on anything like the scale of the Italian front, but French technical missions, attached to the Inter-Allied Military Control Commission in Vienna, did examine surrendered examples, chiefly for intelligence purposes rather than operational adoption. French ordnance officers, drawing on the Direction du Matériel de Guerre, compiled comparative reports weighing the Schwarzlose's toggle lock design against captured German Maxim variants, concluding that whilst the Austrian weapon was cheaper and simpler to produce, its lower rate of fire and comparatively fragile water jacket offered little the French army wished to adopt wholesale. A handful of specimens were shipped to the artillery-proving ground at Bourges for mechanical evaluation, and the findings fed into broader French assessments of Central Powers' ordnance design that circulated among Allied technical staff through 1920 and 1921, though France never fielded the weapon itself. The United States, arriving late to the European theater and never having engaged Austro-Hungarian forces directly, except in a small Italian front expeditionary presence, took the most limited interest of the major allies. American ordnance observers attached to the peace commissions in Vienna and Budapest collected a small number of Schwarzlose specimens, chiefly for the Ordnance Department's reference collection at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, where they were catalogued alongside German and Ottoman captured weapons as part of a broader post-war survey of foreign small arms design. American engineers noted the blowback mechanism's simplicity with professional interest, but drew no direct design lessons applied to subsequent American machine gun development, which continued along the Browning recoil-operated pattern already well established before the war ended. Britain's engagement, though it never fought Austria-Hungary on anything approaching the scale of Italy's Isonzo campaigns, ran deeper than Washington's. British liaison officers, attached to the Inter-Allied Military Control Commission's Vienna and Budapest sections, inspected arsenal returns throughout 1919 and 1920, chiefly to verify Austrian and Hungarian compliance with the disarmament schedules, rather than to acquire the weapon for British service, since the Vickers gun already filled that role admirably within the Army. A small number of Schwarzlose examples were nonetheless shipped to the School of Musketry at Hythe and to the Small Arms School Corps for comparative trials against captured German Maxims already held there, and the resulting technical reports, filed with the War Office in 1921, judged the Austrian design mechanically ingenious but inferior in sustained rate of fire to both the Vickers and the German MG-08. British interest consequently remained academic, feeding into the broader intelligence picture of Central Powers Ordnance rather than prompting any operational adoption, and the handful of specimens retained by British collections passed eventually into the Imperial War Museum's reserve holdings, where examples remain catalogued today alongside far larger collections of German and Ottoman material. If you are enjoying this look at the scattered inheritance of a vanished empire's arsenal, do consider subscribing, as there are a great many more stories like this one still to tell. The systematic reduction of Austria-Hungary's machine gun stocks proceeded under very different pressures than those governing German disarmament. Because so much of the arsenal had already dispersed among 6 or 7 successor states, before any Allied commission could intervene, the Inter-Allied Military Control Commission in Vienna focused its efforts almost entirely on the rump Austrian Republic, rather than attempting the impossible task of tracking every gun across the former empire's territory. Under the Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, Austria was required to surrender or destroy machine guns beyond the modest allowance granted its 30,000-strong army, and commission inspectors oversaw demolition and scrapping at arsenals around Vienna and Wiener Neustadt through 1920 and into 1921. Economic pressure accelerated the process rather than tempering it. Post-war Austria faced catastrophic inflation and metal shortages, and scrap steel from decommissioned weapons found a ready market, meaning commercial incentive and treaty obligation pointed in the same direction. Hungary underwent a parallel but distinct process following the Treaty of Trianon in 1920, which imposed similarly severe limits on the Hungarian army, though Hungarian authorities proved notably less cooperative with inspection than their Austrian counterparts, and clandestine retention of stocks beyond permitted levels was later confirmed by League of Nations investigators through the 1920s. Across the wider region, no single centralized destruction program existed comparable to the vast German scrapping yards. Instead, disposal happened piecemeal, arsenal by arsenal, as each successor state balanced treaty obligation, economic necessity, and its own defense requirements. Reasonable estimates suggest that perhaps half of wartime production was scrapped, sold for metal, or otherwise eliminated within a decade of the armistice, whilst the remainder was retained, converted, or exported, figures that remain imprecise given the fragmentary state of successor state ordnance records from the early 1920s. What survived did so mostly because it kept working. Czechoslovakia retained large numbers in the standard 8.50 Mar chambering well into the 1930s, supplementing them with the newer ZB Vers 26 as that superior Czech design entered production, and photographs from the late 1930s still show Czechoslovak troops training on Schwarzlose guns alongside their modern replacements. Romania acquired roughly 1,000 examples that Fabrique Nationale in Belgium rechambered to 8mm Mauser and fitted with lengthened barrels and water jackets, a rework program that extended their frontline utility into the interwar Romanian army. Hungary developed its own chambering, the MG M0731 in 856 Snefturer, aligning the weapon with its Mannlicher pattern rifles, and keeping variants in Hungarian service through the Second World War. Yugoslav forces likewise retained substantial stocks inherited from Croatian, Slovenian, and Bosnian garrisons of the old Imperial Army. Today, surviving examples are held by the Heeresgeschichtliches Museum in Vienna, which holds one of the most complete collections tracing the weapon's full production history, alongside specimens at the Hungarian Military History Institute and Museum in Budapest, the Wojensky Historicki Ustav in Prague, and smaller holdings at Italy's Museo Storico Italiano della Guerra in Rovereto, a legacy of the Isonzo Front reparations. Individual examples occasionally surface at European militaria auctions, generally missing their original tripods or shoulder stocks, and collectors prize water-cooled variants with intact jackets, since corrosion from decades of storage and unheated arsenal sheds claimed many barrels and cooling systems long before anyone thought to preserve them deliberately. The Schwarzlose's real legacy lies less in any single technical descendant and more in its remarkably long operational shadow. Because it dispersed across so many successor armies rather than concentrating under one victor's control, it remained in active or reserve service in one chambering or another right through to 1945, making it one of the longest-serving designs to emerge from the pre-war Austro-Hungarian arms industry. Its survival illustrates something the more famous disposal stories, the scuttled fleet at Skypa Flow or the burned Zeppelin sheds, do not, that an empire's weapons do not always meet dramatic, single-moment fates. Sometimes they simply get divided up among the empire's former subjects and quietly soldier on for another generation. A slower and less cinematic disappearance, but a disappearance nonetheless once the last working examples finally wore out or were retired for good. When the guns of Austria-Hungary's fortresses and depots fell silent in 1918, nobody organized a formal surrender of the Schwarzlose the way the High Seas Fleet was marched into internment. And that absence of ceremony is perhaps the truest measure of how thoroughly the empire behind the weapon had already ceased to exist. Its 40,000-odd guns simply scattered among the nations born from its collapse, rechambered, renamed, and quietly kept in service until the next war swallowed them entirely. If you found this video insightful, watch what happened to the Austro-Hungarian Navy's Danube River monitors after World War I next. It explores how these formidable armored gunboats were divided among the Danubian successor states and pressed into service on the very waterway they had once patrolled for the Habsburg crown. Like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell for more. Thanks for watching.